Racist cop brings black homeless veteran to court, but when the judge sees his name, everything changes. The funeral of her father, a decorated war veteran, was supposed to be a day of mourning, a day of remembering the sacrifices he made. But for Marie Williams, it turned into a nightmare she could never have predicted. Standing there paying her respects, a police officer stopped her, demanding to see her papers. Despite her presenting a valid military ID, he dismissed it, treating her with nothing but disrespect and even aggression. What he didn't know, though, was that the woman he was humiliating was an undercover FBI agent. And the story behind this event, it's one that will shock you, and it's far from what it first appears. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. We'd love to hear from you. Stay with us because you won't want to miss the twist that's coming up. It was supposed to be a day of reflection and remembrance. Marie Williams, a 36-year-old woman, had come to honor the life of her father, a proud war veteran who had served his country with dignity. But that day at the funeral of the man who had sacrificed so much, Marie's own life was about to change forever. As she stood there, grief heavy in her heart, a police officer approached her. The officer, without warning, demanded that she stop accusing her of needing to show her papers. Marie, a woman who had served her country, just like her father, reached for her military ID, a valid ID that she had carried proudly throughout her years of service. But instead of a gesture of respect, the officer dismissed her ID with cold indifference. What should have been a moment of mourning turned into an awful moment of humiliation. The very institution she had once served was now turning its back on her. The officer wasn't just questioning her identity, he was questioning her right to exist with respect to even be there at her father's funeral. Marie was left standing there, feeling the sting of discrimination as she was subjected to unnecessary and aggressive actions. What hurt the most wasn't the officer's actions, it was the silence that surrounded her. The onlookers who had seen it all unfold stood frozen, unable or unwilling to step in. In that moment, the pain wasn't just personal. It was a reflection of the systemic issues Marie had fought so hard to protect. The weight of the situation wasn't lost on her. This was not just a personal attack, it was a larger reflection of the racial injustice that still runs rampant in society today. The humiliation she felt was a stark reminder that even as a former soldier, she was still not immune to the prejudice of others. Marie Williams had always been proud of the life she had built for herself. As a young woman, she answered the call to serve her country, enlisting in the military with dreams of making a difference. She rose through the ranks, demonstrating remarkable courage and commitment. Throughout her time in Afghanistan, she earned accolades for her service, including a prestigious medal for bravery. Yet despite all her accomplishments, despite the countless lives she had touched in the line of duty, none of that seemed to matter the day she stood in front of the police officer. She was a veteran, someone who had given years of her life to her country, and yet in that moment she was treated as if she was nothing more than a criminal. Marie's military ID, a symbol of her sacrifice, was dismissed with cold indifference. She had done everything right. She had served her country with dignity, but none of that seemed to matter when she was faced with the reality of systemic racism. In that moment, her military background, her dedication, and her identity as a veteran were irrelevant. What mattered was the color of her skin. This was not just an isolated incident. The reality for many black veterans, especially black women, is that they are often subjected to disrespect, suspicion, and unequal treatment, despite the fact that they have sacrificed much for the country. In the eyes of the law and the police, it's as though their service is erased by the prejudice that lurks beneath the surface of society. Marie's story is just one of many that highlight how black veterans, even with their military achievements, are not immune to discrimination. There are countless stories of black veterans who return from war only to face an entirely different kind of battle at home, where they are treated as second-class citizens, where their honor and sacrifices are not acknowledged. Whether it's in the streets, in the courtroom, or even in their workplaces, black veterans continue to face the harsh reality of racism and discrimination. They are often forced to prove their worth time and time again, even though they have already proven it in ways that few can match. For Marie, the pain of this experience was deep. It wasn't just the humiliation of being disrespected in front of others. It was the realization that even after everything she had done for her country, she was still seen as less than. The same country she had fought for, the same people she had sworn to protect, were now the ones treating her as an outsider. This was a painful lesson, one that Marie didn't want to learn, but was forced to confront. It was a stark reminder that for all the progress that has been made, there are still deep-rooted issues that need to be addressed. Discrimination against Black veterans, especially Black women, is an ongoing problem that continues to affect countless lives. Marie's story is not just about one woman's experience, it's a call to action for all of us. It's a reminder that no matter how much we accomplish, no matter how many sacrifices we make, the color of our skin can still determine how we are treated. And for those who have served this country with honor, that is a hard pill to swallow. This reality is not just a chapter in Marie's life, it's a part of a larger painful truth that continues to affect Black veterans all over the country. In the eyes of many, their service, their commitment, and their sacrifice are overlooked because of the color of their skin, and that's something that needs to change. It all started with an anonymous tip. That single anonymous phone call was the catalyst for everything that happened to Marie. It wasn't just a call to the police, it was a call that set in motion a series of events that would change her life forever. The officer, Mark Green, had no idea who she was. He didn't know that she was a decorated veteran, that she had sacrificed years of her life in service to the country. All he knew was that a voice on the other end of the line told him Marie Williams might be someone she wasn't, that she was an imposter. This was a classic example of the kind of systemic issues that have long plagued not only law enforcement, but the larger criminal justice system. An anonymous call from an unknown source turned Marie's life upside down. The police had no concrete reason to stop her, no real evidence that she was a threat. But the moment that phone call came in, everything changed. There's a deep irony in the fact that an anonymous tip without any validation could have such a powerful effect on someone's life. Yet this is the reality that too many people face, especially when it comes to race. Marie didn't know it at the time, but that single call made from a faceless person hiding behind the anonymity of a phone line would be the beginning of a nightmare for her. And it's not just Marie. The history of anonymous calls fueling wrongful accusations is all too familiar. The case of Breonna Taylor is one that comes to mind immediately. In 2020, an anonymous tip led to a raid on Taylor's home, resulting in her tragic death. In both cases, the systems in place failed to ask the right questions. They didn't stop to think. Instead, they acted impulsively, led by rumors and unfounded accusations. It's frightening to think that something as simple as a call made in the dark by someone hiding behind the veil of anonymity can have such devastating consequences. And what's even more chilling is that in this case, the call could have come from someone within the very system meant to protect and serve, the same system that Marie had once proudly been a part of. This too is part of a larger issue that many communities face: the damaging impact of unfounded accusations and the lack of accountability for those who make them. Often those who make these calls are not held responsible for the harm they cause. The people affected, like Marie, are left to pick up the pieces. It's a vicious cycle that perpetuates injustice. The sad reality is that Marie's story is not unique. For so many people of color, particularly Black individuals, the risk of being wrongly accused of having their life turned upside down by an anonymous tip or a false assumption is a constant threat. It's a weight that hangs over them, affecting their interactions with the police, the justice system, and society at large. And like in Marie's case, even when you have everything to prove your innocence, that may not be enough to protect you from the consequences of an unjust system. It's essential to understand that these situations don't exist in a vacuum. They are part of a much larger pattern of systemic racism and inequality that impacts countless people every day. Whether it's an anonymous call, a misunderstanding, or just a simple moment of prejudice, the results can be life-altering. For Marie, that call represented the beginning of a nightmare. But for countless others, this is just a harsh reality that they face every day, one that they don't get to wake up from. And while Marie's story might be one of the more publicized ones, the countless other Black individuals who suffer from these types of experiences remain largely unseen and unheard. They too are victims of a system that often seems more concerned with protecting its own than seeking justice. What's worse in Prosecutor is that the call came from someone within the system, Someone who should have known better, someone who should have had the knowledge and the responsibility to stop this from happening. Instead, that anonymous tip set everything in motion, and Marie was left to pick up the pieces of a life that was forever altered by one phone call. This isn't just a story of one individual's experience. It's a reflection of the larger issues that continue to affect people in America today. It's a reminder that things can change in an instant with no warning because of the actions of someone who isn't held accountable for the consequences. It's a call for justice, a plea for the system to finally acknowledge its flaws and work toward creating a world where no one has to face the consequences of a mistake they didn't make. In the end, Marie's story is a painful reminder of how easily things can go wrong, how one call, one simple anonymous call, can change a person's life forever, and how in a system where accountability is often lacking, those who are most vulnerable are the ones who bear the brunt of the consequences. Mark Green stood tall, a seasoned officer with years of service under his belt, someone who had seen it all, or so he thought. He followed orders without question, trusting the system, and doing what he was told, believing that what he did was always justified. But then there was Sarah Lewis, a new recruit just starting her career in law enforcement. She was still learning, still figuring out where she fit into the larger picture, and she had a lot to prove. At first, Sarah watched quietly as Mark took the lead, executing orders with military precision. He was confident, unwavering, and to Sarah he seemed to have all the answers. But as time passed, something began to gnaw at her. It wasn't just one thing, it was the way Mark handled situations with no empathy, no room for questioning the status quo. It was his strict adherence to rules without considering the human aspect behind them. And it was moments like the one with Marie Williams, when a woman who had served her country proudly was treated as a criminal without cause, simply because someone made an anonymous call. Sarah began to see it clearly. Mark wasn't just doing his job. He was following a system that rewarded blind obedience and punished those who dared to challenge it. The system, she realized, was broken, and that's where she felt the tension build. She knew what she saw wasn't right, but the unspoken pressure from her peers made it so difficult to speak out. The blue wall of silence, as it's often called, was real. This unspoken code within law enforcement that encourages officers to protect one another even when they know something is wrong was something Sarah was now confronting head-on. The blue wall of silence is more than just a catchphrase, it's a culture, a powerful force that keeps officers from speaking out about the misconduct they witness. It's the idea that loyalty to fellow officers is more important than loyalty to justice. It's the belief that to challenge a colleague is to challenge the system, and that's a dangerous thing. But for Sarah, the tension grew. She was torn. On one hand, she had a duty to uphold the law, to do the right thing. On the other hand, Mark was her senior, her colleague, and she felt an unspoken obligation to stand by him. She understood that breaking the code of silence could jeopardize her career, but it also meant standing up for what was right. It was a choice that no officer should have to make, yet it was a decision Sarah would have to face if she ever wanted to maintain her integrity. As the days passed, Sarah's internal conflict deepened. She couldn't ignore what she saw anymore. The patterns of injustice, the blind enforcement of orders that hurt people rather than protect them. She thought back to the way Mark had treated Marie. It was as though he didn't even see her as a person, but as a potential threat, something to be controlled and dismissed. Sarah had seen enough. She couldn't remain silent, not anymore. In private, Sarah began to question her place in this system. She wondered how many other officers felt the same way, trapped by the blue wall of silence, too afraid to speak out against the corruption in the systemic issues they witnessed. She wasn't alone in her doubts. There were other officers quiet in their discontent, wondering whether they could ever make a real difference. But it wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about the broader culture within law enforcement. It was about the idea that the system was bigger than any one officer, that it was too powerful to challenge. This culture was not just oppressive to those outside the force like Marie, but to the officers themselves as well. It forced them into a position where they had to choose between their moral compass and their loyalty to the badge. Sarah knew that speaking out against Mark could cost her everything: her career, her friendships, her standing in the department. They were all at risk. But as time went on, the weight of silence became too heavy to bear. How could she live with herself, knowing she had stayed quiet when something so wrong was happening right in front of her. The decision wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest decisions Sarah would ever make. But slowly, Sarah began to see that there was no such thing as doing your job if it meant turning a blind eye to injustice. She realized that she had a responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, even if it meant going against her colleagues, even if it meant breaking the unspoken code of silence that had held so many officers hostage for so long. Sarah's story isn't just about one woman struggling with her conscience. It's about a deeper issue that runs through law enforcement and society at large. It's about the dangerous power of silence, of looking the other way, and the way that this silence perpetuates inequality and injustice. Every day, officers like Sarah are faced with tough choices. They must decide whether to uphold their oath to serve and protect, or to protect the system that often fails those it's supposed to serve. It's a choice that isn't always black and white. But for Sarah, the answer was clear. She couldn't be part of a system that allowed injustice to thrive, and she couldn't remain silent while others suffered. It's in moments like these that the true character of an individual is revealed. When faced with the decision to stay silent or speak out, Sarah chose to take a stand. And in doing so, she not only challenged the blue wall of silence, but she also found her own voice, one that would ultimately change the course of her career and the lives of those who would come after her. The story of Mark and Sarah is just one example of the complex dynamics that exist within law enforcement. It's a story that sheds light on the tension between loyalty and justice and the difficult choices that officers must make every day. And it's a story that continues to unfold as more officers like Sarah step forward to challenge the system and demand accountability. Officer Mark Green stood tall, an embodiment of authority in his uniform, walking through the crowd as if his presence alone commanded respect. For him, his badge was a shield that granted him the power to enforce the law, but also in his mind the power to dominate any situation. Today, that power was about to be misused in the most unjust way imaginable. He was a man who believed that authority granted him the right to impose his will, no question asked, no explanations needed. When Marie Williams, a woman who had served her country with honor, presented her military ID as a means of proving her identity, Green didn't give it a second thought. To him, her words didn't matter. Her service didn't matter. He saw only a woman of color in front of him, and in that moment, she became just another target in his mind, someone who needed to be controlled, subdued. He didn't ask for her side of the story. He didn't care for her explanation. He saw a figure who didn't fit the mold of his expectations, and that was enough for him to disregard her humanity. Marie's voice, shaky with disbelief and frustration, tried to explain her position. But Officer Green wasn't listening. He was too caught up in the belief that his actions were justified, that the law he upheld was the only truth. What he failed to realize, what he couldn't see, was that the very foundation of the justice system he served was being broken. Justice wasn't about brute force or the ability to make someone bend under the weight of your badge. Justice was about fairness, about listening, about hearing both sides before making judgments. But to Green, this was just another day in the office, another suspect to handle. As Marie stood there helpless, the disbelief washed over her. How could this be happening? She, a woman who had fought for her country, a woman who had risked her life in combat zones like Afghanistan, was now being treated like a criminal. And the worst part? She knew exactly why this was happening. It wasn't because she posed a threat to anyone. It was because of the color of her skin. It was because of the prejudices that clouded Officer Green's judgment. The system, the very one she had once trusted, had failed her in the most glaring way possible. Mark Green's actions in this moment were a glaring example of how the abuse of power can distort the very purpose of law enforcement. When a police officer steps into a situation with a fixed mindset, when they decide that their authority grants them the right to impose their will without question, the result is chaos. The law is supposed to be impartial, fair, and just, yet here it was twisted by Green's unchecked power. His actions weren't just inappropriate, they were dangerous. They threatened the very fabric of the justice system that was supposed to protect people like Marie. This wasn't just a case of one officer making a mistake. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue within the system, an issue that allowed officers like Green to act without fear of consequence. It was a system that allowed individuals to operate without accountability, where authority became an excuse to treat others with disrespect, to ignore their rights, and to push them aside without a second thought. This was a failure not just of an individual, but of an entire structure meant to ensure fairness and equality. When law enforcement officials are allowed to act without consequence when their power is left unchecked, it breeds an environment of mistrust. The very people who are supposed to protect and serve the public become the ones who intimidate and oppress. Green's actions, though personal in nature, were indicative of a larger problem within policing in America, a problem that runs deeper than one incident and one officer. It is systemic. It is ingrained. The danger here is not just that Green mistreated Marie. The danger lies in the fact that his actions were allowed to go unchecked, that his behavior was seen as acceptable within the framework of his role. Officers like Green, when they operate without accountability, perpetuate a cycle of injustice. They create environments where innocent people are treated unfairly simply because they are perceived to be different. The frustration in Marie's eyes as she tried to explain herself was a clear signal of the deep-rooted problem in this interaction. She was a person, a veteran, someone who deserved respect, someone who had served her country with pride. Yet here she was subjected to the worst kind of treatment, being treated as if her identity, her history, and her rights didn't matter. And all because of an officer's unchecked arrogance, his belief that his authority granted him the right to disregard her humanity. This kind of behavior isn't just a violation of individual rights. It is a violation of the principles that law enforcement is supposed to uphold: fairness, justice, and respect for all citizens, regardless of their race, background, or status. When an officer acts with such disregard for these principles, they not only fail the individual they target, they fail the entire community they are sworn to serve. What happened to Marie that day was not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of behavior that we see in law enforcement across the country. It's the type of behavior that leads to situations like the tragic deaths of individuals who were targeted, arrested, or mistreated simply because of their race. And it's the type of behavior that undermines trust in the very institutions that are meant to protect us. Green's actions in this case, while personal, reflect a dangerous and growing trend within policing in America. The abuse of power, the discrimination against people of color, and the complete disregard for the principles of justice. This is why reform is needed. This is why accountability is crucial. Without it, there will continue to be officers like Green who, convinced of their superiority, will abuse their power, creating mistrust and fear in the communities they are supposed to protect. It's not enough to simply say it was a mistake. We must demand more from those who are entrusted with the power to enforce the law. We must demand justice for Marie, for every individual who has ever been mistreated by an officer like Green, and for the future of our justice system. The incident at the funeral, shocking and humiliating, didn't end when the police officer Mark Green walked away. What he didn't know was that a bystander, a simple attendee at the event, had witnessed the entire thing. This observer, realizing the gravity of the situation, pulled out their phone and began recording. What was meant to be a simple personal moment of grief turned into a viral phenomenon, all thanks to the power of social media. The video quickly spread across the internet, catching the attention of millions. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeForMarie and #SayHerName were trending. The video showed not just an unjust moment, it showcased the blatant disregard for justice, for fairness, and for the humanity of a woman who had served her country. It wasn't just about Marie anymore. It was about every Black person, every marginalized individual who had been wronged by those in power, particularly law enforcement. What made this moment so powerful was how quickly it resonated with people. Social media platforms, once seen as places for light entertainment, had now become a battleground for justice. People from all walks of life shared their stories, their anger, and their outrage. The online community became a collective voice demanding that something be done about the injustice they had just witnessed. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up the story. The video, which began as a simple recording, had now become an undeniable force. The world was watching, and they were demanding answers. The narrative had shifted, and the story was no longer about a woman being mistreated by a police officer. It was about systemic racism, about the need for reform, and about the power of ordinary people to expose the truth. social media played a crucial role in amplifying the call for justice. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram allowed millions to come together in ways that were previously unimaginable. The power of these platforms to mobilize people to create movements and to bring attention to issues that might otherwise be ignored is undeniable. This incident wasn't just a moment of outrage, it was the start of something much larger. The video became a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. It was a testament to how far-reaching the influence of social media had become. It wasn't just about sharing a video, it was about shedding light on a problem that had plagued communities of color for generations. It was about making sure that the world knew the truth, that it could no longer be hidden behind closed doors or swept under the rug. In the same vein as the tragic incidents of Eric Garner and George Floyd, this video highlighted the crucial role social media has played in bringing attention to instances of police brutality and systemic injustice. In both of those cases, videos of their deaths circulated online, sparking massive protests and movements for change. These social media-driven movements became a catalyst for reform with public outcry, pushing for greater accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Eric Garner's final words, "I can't breathe," echoed through the streets of New York and beyond, while George Floyd's pleas for help reverberated around the world, inspiring protests in every corner of the globe. Social media was the tool that connected individuals across borders, turning their pain into action. The collective outrage that followed those incidents was amplified by the very same platforms that helped the truth come to light. What made social media so powerful in these instances was its ability to reach people immediately, to spread the truth faster than any traditional news outlet could. The videos of Garner Floyd and now Marie went viral not just because they were shocking, but because they exposed a deeper issue. They forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about race power and the role of law enforcement in perpetuating injustice. But the power of social media doesn't just end with sharing videos. It's also about the conversations that it sparks, the mobilization it creates, and the demands it puts on institutions to change. It provides a platform for voices that are often ignored, for people who feel powerless to make their grievances heard. Social media has become a megaphone for the oppressed, and in the case of Marie, it helped ensure that her story wouldn't fade away into obscurity. As the video continued to spread, people were outraged, but they were also galvanized. Protests began, petitions were signed, and the public's attention was fully focused on the injustice that had taken place. What started as a small act of witnessing an injustice had grown into a massive movement, with millions demanding that Officer Mark Green be held accountable for his actions. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Social media is not just a tool for entertainment or social interaction. It has become a powerful agent for social change, a platform where the stories of the oppressed can be told and where movements for justice can be born. The video that started as a single act of resistance became part of a much larger conversation about race, police brutality, and systemic injustice. It became a symbol of the fight for equality, a symbol that with enough collective power, change can come. Marie's story, amplified by social media, was not just her own. It was the story of countless others who had been wronged, whose voices had been silenced, and whose pain had been ignored. Thanks to the viral spread of this video, the world was finally forced to pay attention. And that attention, fueled by social media, was the first step in demanding justice for Marie and for everyone who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. Marie Williams' experience wasn't an isolated case. Unfortunately, she is not alone. Across the country, countless other Black veterans have faced the same discrimination, being overlooked and dismissed despite their tremendous contributions to the military and the country. The painful truth is that even after serving their nation with honor, many of these veterans, particularly those from marginalized communities, are denied the respect and recognition they deserve. Imagine the frustration of returning from the battlefield, where one has sacrificed so much for their country, only to face a world that still sees you through the lens of prejudice. These are men and women who have fought in wars, sometimes on the front lines, sometimes in the most dangerous conditions, all for a sense of duty to protect and serve their fellow citizens. And yet, when they return home, their status as veterans doesn't shield them from the harsh realities of racial discrimination. Take, for example, the struggles of veterans like Marie, who, despite being decorated and recognized for their bravery, are treated with disdain, suspicion, and even hostility. These veterans come home to find that the system they fought for seems more eager to forget them than to honor them. Their military records filled with commendations and medals do little to protect them from the everyday racism that pervades not only their communities, but the very institutions they once served. These stories are not rare, and they speak to a larger issue, the systemic racism that runs deep within our country. While many veterans are celebrated, those of color often find themselves relegated to the background, their service overshadowed by stereotypes and prejudice. It's as if the nation which they fought to protect still cannot fully embrace them for who they are. Imagine the emotional toll this takes on a person. How does it feel to return from war, knowing that you fought to defend a country that refuses to defend you when you return home? For many, this is not a theoretical question. It is their lived reality. And it's a reality that goes unnoticed, overshadowed by narratives of heroism and sacrifice that fail to acknowledge the deep racial divide in how we view and treat our military personnel. Take the case of James, a black veteran who served in Vietnam and was awarded multiple honors for his bravery. When he returned home, instead of being celebrated for his service, he faced rejection. People refused to acknowledge his achievements. He was a hero on the battlefield, but invisible in the eyes of society. His story mirrors countless others, veterans who came home to face not only the physical scars of war, but the emotional scars of discrimination and neglect. And it's not just about the visible scars of racism. It's about the deep-seated assumptions people make, the biases that shape the way veterans of color are perceived. It's about being denied access to the resources and opportunities that should have been guaranteed to them. It's about facing obstacles when seeking healthcare, education, housing, or even just basic respect in their communities. Marie's story is sadly not an anomaly. It's part of a much larger pattern of marginalization. The reality is that despite the promises made to all veterans, many black service members are still fighting battles that have nothing to do with war. They're fighting against a system that perpetuates inequality, a system that devalues their service simply because of the color of their skin. These veterans, like Marie, have often been denied their rightful place in history. Their contributions to the military, their sacrifices, and their struggles are minimized or overlooked entirely. When their names are mentioned, they are not met with the respect and admiration they have earned, but with indifference. This is a form of erasure, a refusal to acknowledge the full scope of their lives and experiences. And while the fight for equality is often framed as something of the past, it continues today, especially for those who have served in the armed forces. Marie's experience is a stark reminder that we cannot ignore the ongoing struggles of veterans of color. It's not enough to celebrate them for their service. We must ensure that they are treated with dignity and respect long after they've returned home. This is a call to action, not just for those who serve, but for all of us who are charged with ensuring that everyone is treated fairly and equitably. The stories of veterans like Marie and James should be heard, acknowledged, and celebrated. They fought for this country, and it's time this country fought for them. The fight for justice, for respect, and for recognition is far from over. And it is a fight we must all engage in as one nation united. The discrimination faced by veterans of color is not just a moral issue, it's a national one. It reflects how deeply ingrained inequality is in our systems and institutions. If we are to honor the sacrifices of all veterans, we must first acknowledge the inequities that continue to plague those who served. Until then, their struggles, their voices, and their stories will remain hidden in the shadows, just like the countless other veterans who have been forgotten by the very system they fought to protect. In the midst of the chaos and injustice that Marie Williams faced, something else was happening. A rift was beginning to form among the officers who had been part of the scene. Some continued to defend the actions of Officer Green, blindly standing by their colleague. But others, the ones who had witnessed the events firsthand, were beginning to question what had happened. They could no longer ignore the glaring injustice that had unfolded right before them. They started to feel uneasy, unsettled by the way things were handled. The quiet dissonance in their ranks was growing louder by the minute. This was no small matter. It was a crucial moment, a pivotal crossroads for the officers involved. They now faced a choice: stand by their fellow officer, no matter the wrongdoing, or speak up and risk exposing the flaws within their own department. This is the kind of decision that no one should ever have to make. But in this case, it was unavoidable. and the consequences of their choice would not only affect their careers, but could potentially shift the entire course of their lives. It's a phenomenon that has existed for decades within law enforcement, and it's known as the blue wall of silence. This is the unwritten code that often forces officers to protect each other, even when one of their own has clearly overstepped their boundaries. The blue wall is a barrier one that shields the wrongdoer from accountability. It silences those who would speak out against misconduct, often isolating whistleblowers who try to bring the truth to light. The blue wall makes it almost impossible for the system to self-correct, leaving injustice unchecked and perpetuating the cycle of bad behavior. For the officers on the scene, this was their moment to choose. They could either stay silent, reinforcing the toxic culture of protection and denial that had plagued law enforcement for years, or they could take a stand. They could refuse to turn a blind eye to the truth regardless of the consequences. It wasn't just about the guilt or innocence of Officer Green. It was about the integrity of the entire department, the legitimacy of their badge, and their duty to serve and protect the public. This internal struggle between loyalty and justice is a conflict that many officers have faced throughout history, but it's one that often gets swept under the rug, ignored for the sake of maintaining unity within the ranks. Yet time and time again, this mentality has proven dangerous both for officers and for the public they're sworn to protect. If an officer is allowed to act with impunity, it not only damages the reputation of the entire force, but it also erodes the trust of the very community they are meant to serve. Consider the case of past scandals where the blue wall of silence has protected officers from facing consequences. The cases of police brutality that have made national headlines, such as the killings of Eric Garner and George Floyd, were not just the actions of a single rogue officer. These tragedies were allowed to happen because of the complicity of others in the system who failed to speak up, failed to challenge the status quo. They were too loyal to the badge, too scared to question authority, and too unwilling to challenge the culture of silence that protected their colleagues. But in this case, as the events around Marie's mistreatment began to spread, some officers started to question the very system that had conditioned them to stay quiet. This was their moment to break the silence, to stand up for what was right. It's easy to say that justice will prevail, but it's not always easy to act on it. In this environment where loyalty to fellow officers is often valued above accountability, the choice to speak out takes immense courage. The risk of retaliation is real. The fear of being ostracized by peers, or worse, losing their job, is a heavy burden to carry. And yet the story of Marie's mistreatment was a tipping point. The mounting pressure from outside, whether it was from social media or from within the department itself, could no longer be ignored. The silence which had so long protected officers like Green began to fracture. What would happen next? Would these officers follow the same old path, protecting one of their own? Or would they choose a new path, one that recognized that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting a colleague? This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the integrity of law enforcement as a whole. It was about breaking the cycle of silence that had allowed abuses of power to persist unchecked. It was about proving that the badge they wore wasn't just a symbol of authority, but also one of responsibility, accountability, and fairness. It was about making the choice to uphold the law even when it meant holding fellow officers accountable. As the dust settled, it became clear the walls of silence were starting to crack. Some officers would speak up. Some would remain silent. But the conversation had begun, and that in itself was a victory. Because once the truth starts to come out, there's no turning back. The foundation had been shaken. Change, though slow, was on the horizon, and no one officer or civilian could pretend that things would ever be the same again. As the investigation into the incident with Marie Williams unfolded, what was initially perceived as a single isolated event quickly expanded into something much larger. The discovery of misconduct within the police department didn't stop with Officer Green. Slowly but surely, the investigators began to unearth a network of corruption, collusion, and cover-ups that ran much deeper than anyone had ever anticipated. What started as a single incident of racial profiling and police brutality revealed a much darker reality, one that stretched far beyond just a few bad apples. The deeper they dug, the more the truth began to reveal itself. Evidence that had been deliberately concealed began to surface. Documents were found that had been purposefully altered or discarded, all to cover up the mistakes and misconduct of those in power. And at the center of it all were the officers who had either turned a blind eye or had actively participated in these wrongdoings, believing they could operate with impunity. It wasn't just Officer Green. It wasn't just one bad apple. It was a system one that had been built on secrecy and loyalty over justice. This wasn't the first time such a situation had occurred, and unfortunately it wouldn't be the last. The history of law enforcement in America is riddled with similar stories. Stories where corruption and abuse of power were allowed to fester unchecked by proper oversight. One of the most notorious incidents that highlighted the dangers of such unchecked power was the case of Rodney King. In '91, King was brutally beaten by 4 Los Angeles police officers. The incident was caught on camera, and it shocked the nation. However, the officers involved were acquitted despite the clear evidence of excessive force. The public outcry that followed sparked the infamous 1992 Los Angeles riots, which were a direct response to the blatant injustice that had occurred. Much like the Rodney King case, the story of Marie Williams opened the door to something far bigger. The investigation into her mistreatment wasn't just about holding Officer Green accountable. It was about peeling back the layers of a system that had allowed such abuses to thrive. The culture of silence, the unwillingness to hold colleagues accountable, and the deep-seated prejudice in some corners of law enforcement were all laid bare. And as the investigation continued, the full scope of this corruption began to take shape. For the first time, the public began to see that what had happened to Marie wasn't just a random incident or a simple mistake. It was part of a much larger pattern. And this pattern wasn't confined to one department or one city. This was a nationwide issue. Across the country, similar cases of police brutality and racial profiling had been swept under the rug, dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstood situations. But now, with the spotlight firmly on the police force in Marie's case, the cracks in the system were becoming impossible to ignore. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that the systemic problems within the police force ran deep. Officers who had been involved in misconduct for years, who had covered up their mistakes and protected each other from accountability, were now being exposed. Investigators found a pattern of false reports, destroyed evidence, and manipulated testimony, all designed to protect the guilty and shift the blame onto innocent people. The deeper they dug, the more they found, and the more the public began to demand accountability. But this wasn't just about one police department or one city. It was about a culture that had allowed these abuses to go on for far too long. The public's frustration grew as more details about the police's systemic failures came to light. The scandal surrounding Marie's case soon became a rallying cry for those who had been victims of police misconduct for years. People who had once been silenced by fear or indifference now felt emboldened to speak out, knowing they weren't alone. They too had been victims of a system that had failed them, and now they demanded justice. The investigation into the network of corruption within the police force would take months, and the revelations that came to light would shock the nation. But it also marked a turning point in the fight for justice. People could no longer turn a blind eye to the abuses of power that had gone on for far too long. The system, as broken as it was, could no longer hide the truth. The investigation would lead to reforms, to changes in policy, and to a renewed focus on accountability. The stories of Marie and others like her would become the catalyst for a movement that sought to change the very foundation of the justice system. But for those who had lived through the darkness of this corrupt system, the journey wasn't over. The battle for justice, for transparency, and for accountability was just beginning. And as the truth came to light, the question remained, would the system change? Would those who had been complicit in these crimes be held accountable, or would the cycle of corruption continue? Only time would tell, but one thing was clear. The truth had been exposed, and the fight for justice was far from over. Marie stood at a crossroads. What had started as an act of blatant injustice, a moment where her dignity and rights were stripped away in front of her, could have easily defined the rest of her life. But Marie wasn't the kind of woman to let her spirit be broken. She had fought for this country once before, and now she was ready to fight again. But this time her fight wasn't about just surviving, it was about changing the system that had allowed such wrongs to happen in the first place. She knew that revenge wouldn't bring her the peace she sought. No, the battle she had to fight now was bigger than herself. It wasn't just about one officer's wrongdoing, nor just one moment of humiliation. It was about the larger system, the culture of impunity within law enforcement, the way marginalized voices like hers were ignored, and the way those in power manipulated the very system meant to protect people like her. With every ounce of her being, she decided she would no longer be a passive victim. Marie was determined to hold those responsible accountable, but she also wanted to ensure no one else would ever have to endure what she had gone through. And so with resolve and courage, Marie began speaking out, using her voice, her story as a weapon against the very forces that had sought to silence her. She found strength in telling the truth and vowed that her fight for justice would be more than personal retribution. It would be a movement not only to correct what had been done to her, but to ensure that no other Black woman, no other veteran, and no other person would ever face such blatant injustice again. As she began to speak out, Marie became a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience and a force for change. She wasn't just sharing her pain, she was sharing her power. Her story became a testament to the strength of standing firm in the face of adversity, refusing to back down, and fighting for what is right. And soon others began to rally around her. The people who had once witnessed her humiliation were now joining her in her quest for justice, her journey to bring down the system of inequality and mistreatment. Marie's transformation from a victim to a leader was nothing short of remarkable. She didn't let herself be defined by the humiliation of that day. Instead, she used it as fuel for something greater. Her story was spreading like wildfire far beyond the courtroom where it all began. People who had once been silent now found their voice through her bravery. They stood beside her, rallied around her cause, and began speaking up against the injustices they too had experienced. The injustice that had plagued Marie's life had now turned into a rallying cry, a call for others to join in the fight for equality. With every step she took, Marie became more than just an individual fighting for justice. She became a symbol of hope for millions who had been ignored, marginalized, and silenced for far too long. Her story was a reminder that change doesn't come from passivity, it comes from action, from standing up, from refusing to accept the status quo. Marie's journey wasn't easy. Every step toward justice was met with resistance with those who tried to stop her, to discredit her, and to push her back into silence. But every setback only fueled her more. Every attempt to break her only made her stronger. And through her perseverance, her message became clearer. And clearer, the fight for justice isn't just about the individual. It's about the collective power of standing together, of refusing to be silenced, and of demanding change from a system that has long been broken. And so Marie continued to push forward. She knew that the battle was far from over, that the road ahead was long, and that change wouldn't come easily. But she also knew that every voice added to the chorus of justice, every step she took toward accountability, would bring her closer to a world where no one, no matter their race, no matter their background, would have to face the kind of injustice she had endured. She was more than just a survivor. She was a force for transformation, a champion for those whose voices had been lost in the system. Marie's story was a story of hope, of perseverance, and of the power of one voice to ignite a movement. It wasn't just about her fight for justice. It was about the fight for every person who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or forgotten. And through it all, Marie held on to one simple truth. The truth will always come out. And when it does, it has the power to change everything. As her journey continued, Marie's courage became contagious, spreading from one person to the next. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way to rise up, to stand for what is right, and to make a difference. Her message was clear. Never stop fighting for justice, never stop speaking out, and never let the system define your worth. Marie had fought for her country once. Now she was fighting for her place in history, her rightful place among those who had stood up, not just for themselves, but for the future of a more just society. The days following the incident at Marie's father's funeral were filled with shock and disbelief. What was meant to be a somber farewell turned into a tragic moment that sparked a movement. As the video of Marie's unjust treatment by the police officer Mark Green circulated across social media, the public's anger grew stronger. People from all walks of life began to rally together, united by a shared desire for justice and an unwavering belief that this type of injustice could not continue. Protests erupted in cities across the nation. What started as a small group of individuals gathered to support Marie's cause quickly gained momentum, snowballing into massive demonstrations. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds took to the streets, holding signs and chanting for change. This was not just about one woman's story. This was about a deep-seated issue that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The outcry reached far beyond the police department that had wronged Marie, reverberating through every institution where injustice had been allowed to thrive unchecked. As the protests intensified, the media took notice. News outlets across the country began reporting on the growing movement, shining a spotlight on the systemic issues that had led to the mistreatment of Marie and countless others like her. The images of people marching, holding their fists high in solidarity, were broadcast on national television, forcing the country to confront the ugly truths it had long tried to ignore. But it wasn't just the protesters who were taking action. The public's outrage pushed local and national leaders to address the growing demand for reform. Politicians who had once been silent on issues of police brutality now found themselves under pressure to take a stand. Calls for accountability grew louder, with demands for transparency and the implementation of new policies to ensure that such abuses of power would not go unpunished. Lawmakers began introducing bills aimed at reforming police practices, holding officers accountable for misconduct, and ensuring that no one, regardless of their background or race, would ever face the kind of injustice Marie had endured. As the demonstrations continued, the voices of the oppressed grew stronger. Marie's story became a symbol of the countless individuals who had been wronged by a system that too often overlooked their humanity. Her experience, shared by millions, resonated deeply with people who had lived through similar hardships, people who had been ignored, silenced, or dehumanized by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. The protests were not just about one woman's fight for justice. They were a call to action for the entire nation to confront its history of racial inequality and to demand a future where justice was truly for all. The wave of protests and the media attention they garnered also led to a broader cultural shift. People began to have more open and honest conversations about race, power, and privilege. Communities that had long been divided began to come together, acknowledging the disparities that existed and working toward a more just and inclusive society. The conversations that had once been relegated to the fringes of society were now front and center, as people from all walks of life rallied around the idea that systemic change was not just necessary, it was urgent. The comparisons to past movements such as the civil rights movement of the 1960s were inevitable. Just as the marches in Selma helped to shift the national conversation on race and justice, so too did these modern-day protests. The tragic death of George Floyd in 2020 had already ignited a global movement, but Marie's story brought something new to the table. A story of survival, of fighting back against a broken system, and of reclaiming agency in the face of adversity. Her story became part of a larger narrative of change that was sweeping across the world. This wave of change wasn't just about police reform, it was about a complete rethinking of the way society viewed justice. It was about dismantling systems of oppression that had been ingrained for generations and replacing them with systems that uplifted and protected everyone, not just the privileged few. The protests were a clear message: enough was enough. Through the lens of Marie's story, the nation began to see the stark contrast between the promises of justice and the reality of inequality. And as the movement grew, so did the collective understanding that change wouldn't come from silence. It wouldn't come from waiting for someone else to act. It came from the people, the individuals who stood together, who raised their voices in unity, and who refused to be silenced any longer. The marches, the signs, the chants, they weren't just a call for justice for Marie. They were a call for justice for everyone. In the face of overwhelming adversity, Marie's courage had sparked a fire that was impossible to extinguish. Her name became synonymous with hope, with resistance, and with the unwavering belief that change was not just possible, it was necessary. The protests were not the end of the fight, but a powerful beginning. The nation had been shaken awake. The truth had been exposed, and the people were demanding change. As the movement continued to grow, it was clear that this moment would go down in history as a turning point. What had started as a single story, a single incident of injustice, had grown into a movement that could no longer be ignored. And while the road to real change would be long, the people who had stood up for justice, the people who had marched and protested, knew that they were on the right side of history. This was more than just a moment, it was a movement that Marie Williams had ignited and one that would continue to burn brightly for generations to come. Marie Williams' journey didn't end with the protests. It didn't end with the media attention or the support from the community. It began a new chapter, one of relentless determination and unwavering commitment to change. She became more than just a woman fighting for justice. She became a beacon of hope, a symbol of resistance and the embodiment of a movement that sought not only justice for her, but for all those who had been wronged. Her voice echoed through the halls of power, through the hearts of millions who had experienced the same injustice. Marie didn't just want her story to be heard. She wanted to change the system that had failed her and so many others. The system that had allowed people like Officer Green to act without fear of consequences. The system that allowed racial profiling, discrimination, and abuse of power to persist unchecked. For Marie, this was no longer just a fight for her own dignity. It was a fight for the dignity of every marginalized individual who had been ignored by the system, dismissed by the very institutions designed to protect them. Through her tireless efforts, Marie began working with lawmakers and activists to push for reforms in the police force. She wasn't just seeking a change in policy, she was advocating for a cultural shift within law enforcement, a shift that would hold officers accountable and ensure that every citizen was treated with the respect they deserved. Marie's work didn't stop at protests and speeches. It moved into the halls of Congress, into meetings with those in power, and into conversations that had to be had. She fought not just for justice, but for a future where the pain and trauma she had experienced would never happen to anyone again. Her message was clear. Justice could not be delayed. The time for change was now. The system could not continue to operate with impunity. Marie's determination fueled her desire to break down the walls of inequality and injustice that had plagued society for generations. She understood that true change had to come from within the system itself. It had to come from those in power taking responsibility and from everyday citizens demanding more, demanding better. As she continued to speak out and fight for the rights of those who had been silenced for far too long, Marie became an inspiration for others to stand up. Her story showed that it was possible to fight back, to push through the darkest of times and still emerge stronger. It showed that one voice, even in the face of unimaginable adversity, could spark a revolution of change. But Marie also knew that change wasn't easy. It wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. But she believed that if enough people stood together, if enough people pushed for reform, change was possible. It had to be possible. For Marie, the fight was not just about justice for herself, but about creating a society where no one would ever again be dehumanized or dismissed simply because of their race, gender, or background. The end of Marie's story was not an end at all. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Her commitment to justice, her dedication to reform, and her belief in the power of collective action inspired countless others to rise up. Marie's courage didn't just change the course of her life, it changed the course of history. And now her message reaches you. The fight for justice is far from over. You too have the power to stand up. You too can be a part of this change. You can help ensure that justice doesn't just exist for a few, but for all. This is the time to act. This is the moment to make a difference. If you believe in justice and equality and in the power of standing up for what's right, then join us. Don't wait. Speak out. Take action. Together, we can make a change. If you want to stay updated on more powerful stories like this, and if you want to be part of the conversation about justice, subscribe to our channel. Don't miss out on how you can make a difference, because when one voice speaks, it can lead to a wave of change. And remember, never back down. Keep fighting for what's right.